Hey there, pirates. Welcome aboard the Anime No Me channel. Luffy is going to inherit Gall D. Rogers' sword called Ace, and you're going to find out how in today's video. It all begins with the Sword Ace, revealed in the manga as Rogers' iconic weapon, a supreme katana that slices seas and rivals as if they were butter. It's mentioned in chapter 967 during Odin's flashback, where Roger wields it to duel Whitebeard in a clash so fierce it splits the sky. Ace isn't just a sword, it carries the legacy of the Pirate King, forged with supreme haki, echoes Roger's will to be free, as seen in Chapter 0 when he laughs during his execution in Logtown. Now picture Luffy, the boy who inherited the straw hat from Shanks, which in turn came from Roger in Chapter 1, inheriting the Sword Ace as well. This inheritance would make perfect sense. Luffy, as Joy Boy reborn in Chapter 1043, carries the inherited will that Roger awaited in Chapter 968, and the sword could become the ultimate symbol of that legacy, either passed down by Shanks or discovered in Laugh Tale. Imagine the scene. After Elbaf in Chapter 1158, where the giants tell stories about Roger, Luffy comes across the Sword Ace guarded by Dory and Brogy, who once fought alongside Roger in Chapter 116. He picks it up and boom! The blade shines with haki, recognizing the spirit of Nika, the sun god that Luffy awakens in Chapter 1044. With his goofy grin, Luffy would swing the sword like a baseball bat. Ha ha ha, this is awesome! Can I stretch it too? But Ace, one of the 12 supreme blades like Mihawk's Yoru from Chapter 1070, could react to Gear 5, turning into an elastic weapon that cuts the air like fiery rubber, blending Roger's style with Luffy's chaos. That would be insane, because Luffy, who has always fought with his fists since Chapter 1, would gain a tool to face swordsmen like Shanks or Garling in Chapter 1160, pushing his arsenal to cosmic levels. Zoro, the swordsman who swore to surpass Mihawk back in Chapter 5, would react with a mix of shock, envy, and determination that would make fans laugh and tremble. In Chapter 597, Zoro trains with Mihawk to become the best. Seeing Luffy wield Roger's sword, the man Mihawk admired in Chapter 560 would feel like a punch to the ego. With his scarred eye and tough demeanor, Zoro might freeze for a second, then smirk sarcastically. Hey, Captain, you gonna use that to scratch your back? Hand it over, I'll show you how a real sword cuts. But deep down, he'd be furious not at Luffy, but at the challenge of surpassing a legendary blade in the hands of an amateur who prefers punching like Luffy did against Kaido in Chapter 1049. Zoro's reaction would be epic, because he's always collected swords like Wado Ichimonji and Enma in Chapter 955, and Ace would be the ultimate prize, pushing him to train harder, maybe even asking Luffy for a duel just to test the sword, sparking a friendly rivalry arc reminiscent of his spats with Sanji back in Chapter 85. The inheritance of Ace by Luffy makes sense because of deep connections. Roger, who laughed at fate in Chapter 968, saw in Luffy the right one he had been waiting for, passed through Shanks in Chapter 1. Shanks, saved by Dragon in Chapter 1160, could hand over the sword to Luffy in Elbaf, saying, "Roger told me this was meant for you, kid, it's yours now." Luffy, in his innocence, would use Ace creatively, stretching the blade with Gear 5 in Chapter 1045 to create slashes that mix cutting with elasticity. Something like a Gomu Gomu no slash that splits islands. That would be both hilarious and powerful, turning Luffy into a hybrid pirate swordsman who breaks conventions just like he did against Lucci in Chapter 1070. Zoro's initial fury would soon become motivation. In Chapter 1033, he swears to surpass Mihawk through his sword. With Luffy wielding Ace, he'd train harder to prove that skill beats legacy. He might even ask to borrow Ace to hone his Enma, again tying back to Chapter 955. Picture Zoro brandishing 3 glowing blades, squaring off against Luffy with Ace. "Captain, let's see if that relic cuts better than my swords." This dynamic would add humor and tension to the crew, with Zoro both envying and respecting Luffy, echoing his loyalty from Chapter 485 when he sacrificed himself for him. And of course, Luffy would use Ace casually, maybe to cut meat at a feast, driving Zoro mad. That sword is sacred, not a can opener. The theory deepens with symbolism. Ace sharing the name of Luffy's brother, introduced in Chapter 154, becomes a double tribute to both his fallen brother and the Pirate King. Luffy inheriting it in the final saga, maybe after meeting Shanks in Chapter 1054, would be poetic, especially with the blade reacting to Nika's haki in Chapter 1043, shining like the sun itself. Zoro, whose dream since Chapter 6 has been to be the greatest, would see this as a personal challenge, training harder to surpass a mythical weapon. He might even duel Luffy in a tense moment, like in Thriller Bark back in Chapter 485. That would be epic, raising Zoro's growth arc to new heights. with him admitting, "Captain, you with Ace makes me want to cut the very sky." In the lore, Ace is a supreme blade like the Shodai Kitetsu from chapter 955, and Luffy wielding it would add versatility, combining fists with elastic slashes against Imu in chapter 1085. Zoro's reaction would be the spice, initial envy turning to respect, maybe asking to forge a sister sword to Ace, infused with supreme haki he learns in chapter 1010. It would be hilarious to see Zoro obsessively polishing his swords while Luffy plays with Ace, saying, "Relax, Zoro, it's just a sword," only for Zoro to snap back, "Just a sword? That's the King's blade? I'll surpass it, and you too." This inheritance would transform the crew's dynamics. Luffy, who has always fought freely since chapter 1, would gain discipline through Ace, honoring Roger. Zoro, as the rival and protector, would evolve alongside him, maybe even developing a style that complements Luffy's elasticity. In chapter 967, Roger used Ace to duel Whitebeard. Luffy, inheriting it, would close the circle, with Zoro standing as the swordsman guarding the new king. This theory is wild because it adds both emotional and power layers, with Zoro's reaction from fury to motivation becoming a friendship arc that makes One Piece shine. Luffy could inherit Gall D. Rogers' Sword Ace, a theory that would flip the One Piece world upside down, turning the rubbery pirate king into a legendary swordsman and leaving Zoro, the blade hunter, with a mix of shock, envy, and fire in his eyes. Let's dive into this speculation with 4,000 words of pure hype, exploring how Luffy would wield the Pirate King's relic and the hilarious yet intense reaction of Zoro, all grounded in manga lore up through September of 2025. Ace enters the story as Roger's iconic weapon, a supreme katana that splits the air with haki so powerful it cracks the sky, as shown in Odin's flashback in chapter 967, where Roger uses it to duel Whitebeard in a clash remembered for ages. It's not just any blade, it carries the legacy of the man who found the One Piece and laughed at fate in Laugh Tale in chapter 968, symbolizing the absolute freedom Roger stood for. Now, imagine Luffy the boy, who inherited the straw hat from Shanks, which came from Roger in chapter 1, inheriting Ace as well. This passing would make sense because Luffy, as Joy Boy's reincarnation in chapter 1043, embodies the inherited will Roger awaited in chapter 968. The sword could become the ultimate emblem of that lineage, perhaps guarded by Shanks or discovered in Elbaf among giants retelling Roger's legends in chapter 1158. Imagine the vibe of this inheritance. Luffy, with his goofy grin and elastic body, grabbing Ace and swinging it like a baseball bat, shouting, "Ha ha ha, this cuts better than my fists," while the blade glows with supreme haki, reacting to Gear 5 that turns the world into flaming rubber in chapter 1045. Ace, one of the 12 supreme blades like Mihawk's Yoru in chapter 1070, could adapt to Luffy's style, becoming a weapon that stretches with his gears, unleashing insane attacks like a Gomu Gomu no slash that splits islands in half. This would be crazy because Luffy, who has always fought with stretching fists since chapter 1, would gain versatility to face swordsmen like Garling Figurland in chapter 1160, or even Shanks, elevating his arsenal to levels that blend Roger's legacy with the chaos of Nika, the sun god who laughs at physics. Zoro, the swordsman who swore to surpass Mihawk in chapter 5 and collects blades like Wado Ichimonji and Enma in chapter 955, would explode with emotions that are pure gold for any fan. He who trains to the bone with Mihawk in chapter 597 to become the best in the world would see Luffy with Ace. The sword of the man Mihawk admired as a rival in chapter 560 as a punch to the ego. Zoro would freeze for a second, his eye scar glowing, then flash a sardonic smirk. "Captain, you gonna use that to scratch your back or cut meat? Leave it to me, I'll show you how a relic like this really shines." But inside, envy would burn like a Kanu's magma, pushing him to train even harder, maybe asking to duel Luffy to test Ace, sparking a friendly rivalry reminiscent of his fights with Sanji in chapter 85 but with higher stakes. Zoro's reaction would be hilarious and profound because he lives for swords. In chapter 1033, he swears to surpass Mihawk with Enma, feeling the spirit of the blades. Seeing Luffy, an amateur who prefers punches like in chapter 1049 against Kaido, wield a mythical sword like Ace would initially enrage him, but then fuel his growth. With Zoro thinking, "If the captain has the king's sword, I'll cut the very sky to keep up." This would add both tension and humor to the crew, with Zoro obsessively polishing his swords while Luffy casually wields Ace, maybe to open coconuts on the Sunny, making Zoro growl, "That sword is sacred, not a can opener." But deep down, Zoro would respect it, seeing it as a challenge that makes him stronger, just like when he sacrifices himself for Luffy in chapter 485, proving that loyalty comes before ego. This inheritance of Ace for Luffy makes perfect sense in the lore, because Roger, who laughed at death in chapter 0, saw in figures like Luffy the future he could not witness, passing the hat to Shanks, who gave it to the boy in chapter 1. With Ace, Luffy would honor this, blending Roger's precise cuts with his elasticity, creating a hybrid style that challenges enemies like Yimu in chapter 1085, whose shadowy powers could be sliced by a blade infused with Nika's haki. Zoro, who has dreamed of becoming the greatest swordsman since chapter 6, would see this as a personal test, maybe envying the sword, but using that fire to refine his Santoryu, as in chapter 1010 against Kaido when he unleashes supreme haki. It would be epic to see Zoro asking Luffy to lend Ace for training, the two dueling on deck, Luffy stretching the blade while Zoro slices the air with 3 swords, shouting, "Show me what the king's sword can do, Captain!" The symbolism of Ace is perfect. Named after Luffy's brother in chapter 154, the sword becomes a double tribute to the brother lost in Marineford in chapter 576, and to the pirate king who inspired an era in chapter 0. Luffy wielding it would be poetic, the blade reacting to his laughter like Nika in chapter 1044, maybe glowing with solar flames that complement Katakuri's mochi or Sabo's fire. Zoro's reaction would add layers. Initial envy turning into respect, admitting that the sword chose Luffy for his freedom, motivating him to surpass even mythical relics. In chapter 955, Zoro gains Enma, which absorbs haki. Imagine him comparing it to Ace, thinking, "My blade is hungry. The captain's has the king's spirit. Time to cut higher." This dynamic would transform the crew. Luffy, who has fought freely since chapter 1, would gain discipline with Ace, honoring Roger, while Zoro evolves to protect the new king. It would be hilarious to see Luffy using the sword for playful antics, like slicing fruit in midair, while Zoro freaks out, "Captain, respect the blade." But deep down, Zoro would be grateful, seeing it as a challenge that makes him the ultimate swordsman, just like when he cuts Pika in chapter 778. This theory is insane because it adds emotion and power, with Zoro's reaction from rage to motivation becoming a friendship arc that makes One Piece shine, connecting Roger's past to Luffy's future as the god who laughs at fate. That was today's content. We hope you liked it and want to share your opinion on the subject. Don't forget to share the video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care and stay amazing.